Hello and welcome to episode 36 of the Peterpodcast. I'm your host, reporter Taylor Clydesdale, and with me this week is Jim Russell. Jim is running for council in Town Ward in the October municipal election, and today we're going to be talking about improving housing for people in poverty in Peterborough.
The number two reason people are homeless is just unsafe housing conditions. And so I think, and one of the things I would rail against, quite frankly, if I was on council, is absentee landlords. I think it's important that, people that are renting and owning properties and renting to people are held accountable, and that we enforce bylaws around the quality of housing for people.
And we're also going to be talking about income and transportation. So, hope you enjoy the show.
Taylor, my name is Jim Russell, and I'm here today because you invited me here today. And you invited me here today because I'm one of the many people that are running in the upcoming municipal election, and I happen to be running for the open seat in Town Ward. Well, there's two open seats, but there was one vacated by Diane Therian, who's running for mayor. So I'm here in that capacity. Happy to throw my hat in the ring and happy to talk about things that I think are important in the city and why people should vote for me, and I'd be a good candidate around the council table.
Why should people vote for you?
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of reasons. I first of all I'm a bit of a political junkie, so I grew up in a family where I was 7, and my mother sat me down in front of our old black and white TV in 1967. And at 68, and it was the year that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was elected leader of the Liberal Party. Now, I was 7. I didn't know what was going on, but I remember at the time my mom saying to me, "This is really, really important, and you need to understand that." And every year since 1968, I've watched every single leadership convention of every single political party and would have the same routine, watching the speeches on Friday night, watching the drama unfold on Saturdays as the votes are coming in. And so I really began to appreciate just the power of politics, the importance of politics. And I grew up in a generation where there were political giants. I mean, Pierre Elliott Trudeau being one, Stanley Knowles being another. And so I began to really see and value and appreciate political leadership and the importance of that to people in the country. And I get we live in a time of cynicism around politics, and I think much of that is justified, absolutely justified. But I also think the quickest way to change people's lives and to make a community better and a society better is through the stroke of a pen, through social policy. And I think we want great minds and great people that are in political roles. So I think it's something that's been there for me aspirationally throughout my life, and I was always curious about what that might mean for me to throw my hat in the ring politically. And I saw this opportunity come up. I mean, I've been thinking about this for about a year and a half. I had some early indication that Diane was considering running for mayor, and that would open up a seat in Town Ward. I live in Town Ward. I work in Town Ward, and I talked to a lot of people about what that might mean in terms of my style, my personality, my values being around the council table. And I decided that I didn't want to just sit on the sidelines and complain. And I was really frustrated. I mean, again, I watch council every week, and I was frustrated this last year in particular, but the entire term, with the number of 6-5 votes that went on. And one of the things I really value about municipal politics is the lack of partisan politics. And what I found was we had party politics system at our municipal level. It was the party of 6 and it was the party of 5, right? Mm-hmm. And that only lends itself to entrenchment, and it doesn't lend itself to consensus, which I think is important. And I think if we're going to solve big problems for the city, we need 10 really, really smart people. We need to put them in a room, and we need them to be listening to each other and listening to constituents and really valuing discourse. And so I think I bring a skill set that values that, and I think that I'd be an interesting voice by virtue of my background and my experience and my desire to serve the community. I mean, I'm new to Peterborough. I've been here 7 years, and I'm digging in, and I plan to have my bones buried here. So I want to make sure that this is and I'm a new stepfather, and I have a sense of how we need to make sure that this place is something that serves generations to come. And so I feel it's an extension of my values, my desires, my aspirations, and that I have some runway left in terms of leadership, and I want to leave it all on the field. So those would be some of the reasons that drew me to run, and I think some of the reasons people may want to choose to vote for me.
Okay. Now, you mentioned some key things, especially around 6-5 votes. I just want to put those in bed for just a moment because I want to talk about your skill set.
Sure.
And what's your background? What's your experience, especially the stuff that makes you qualified to be a counselor?
Sure. Well, certainly, there's certainly, I think that's a fair question, and desire to do it isn't enough qualification. I think that's completely fair, though anyone is allowed to run. So my background is in social work. I have a bachelor's degree in social work from Ryerson in Toronto, and I have a master's degree in social work from U of T in Toronto, and I've been working in the social service field for the last 30 plus years. I've worked in food banks, I've worked in addictions and mental health, I've worked in injury prevention, and then later in my career I had more leadership roles. And certainly people would know me best in Peterborough as the CEO of the United Way of Peterborough District. And so I think the combination of understanding issues as they affect family, whether they're mental health, whether they're addictions, whether they're family breakdown, certainly issues of poverty as they affect families and communities. I have experience of that, experience working in those fields. And then locally here in Peterborough, I've been on the policy committee of the Chamber of Commerce. I was a founding board member of the Mount Community Center. I sit on and have sat on the Peterborough Poverty Reduction Network for the last 7 years since I've been here. I currently also sit on the Workforce Development Board. So I bring a breadth of experience around issues, a breadth of experience around certainly nonprofit leadership. But I also bring a business acumen. I mean, the organization that I run has revenues of $2 million a year and has assets of another $2 million a year. And so I'm responsible for building budgets. I'm responsible for hiring and firing. I run a business as well. And I think there's something unique about the way that nonprofit leaders think about issues that aren't always exclusively and solely about the bottom line, but also have to respect the bottom line. And I have to tell you, I mean, most of the agencies that I'm familiar with struggle with the bottom line because funding is tight and they have to make tough decisions. And so there's business acumen that comes as well with being a nonprofit leader. So I think all of those things lend itself to add value to a council, and I really think that skill set at a council table would really lend itself to the discourse that needs to happen.
I'd love to see you at a council table at around budget time when all those discussions are going on about what the city can and can't afford, because every year there's so much that the city can't afford. But long before we get to that point, maybe you can talk about your experience in social work and how that might affect what you would do on council. How does your background in social work and helping people in the United Way, how does that impact how you would, what you would do as a counselor?
Yeah, I think I would even go farther back than just my background in studying social work and being in the social service field. I think it goes back to my values and the family I was brought up with. I mean, the work I chose to do is an extension of the values I was brought up with. I grew up in a working class family. My father was a union member. He drove bus in Toronto. And our discussions around a dinner table were always pretty political. I have a family now that has all the political parties covered. I have a brother who's conservative. I have a sister who's liberal. I have me who's pretty left, and I have a brother who's indifferent to the whole process and is off the grid. And
my favorite brother.
Yeah, just off the grid. Completely indifferent to the process. And I think for me early on, the values I was raised with was how is this going to affect people? Don't be selfish. Think about your neighbor. What can you do to help? I don't know how that got passed on. I think in part it got passed on in the genes. My father's from Ireland and my mother's from Cape Breton, and this deep sense of community in both those cultures. But I think it was also growing up working class, and that you thought about what's important to working class people, and it's the ability to kind of put a roof over the head and heads of children, and put food on a table, and what is it you can do to make a community better. So I think I had those values are instilled pretty easy, that you always pitched in and helped, whether it was something as simple as shoveling a neighbor's driveway, and I think then that took root for me, and when I was looking at my life and what it is I wanted to do for a career, I decided to be a social worker. But I spent 5 years in a Christian community. I lived in L'Arche for 5 years, and L'Arche are communities, international communities across the world that people, so-called normal people, live with people that have intellectual handicaps, and that was very formative for me in terms of, how is it we think of people that are different. How is it that we value everyone regardless of their intellectual abilities or physical abilities? And I think that I describe that as my post-secondary education, my 5 years that I spent living and working in L'Arche. And then I think when I started to think about what I wanted to do as a career, then I chose social work and went to Ryerson. So I think my values were set fairly young, and I think what continues to be at the forefront for me when I think of a political career, I think in political terms, and I think in economic terms, and I think there is a widening gap between those that have money and those that don't have money. There's a widening gap in our community and indeed across the country, and I think that's not right. And so I feel that there needs to be a bit of a social justice perspective, and I think we need to be mindful of anyone that chooses to call Peterborough home, not just those that have been here for generations, but those that have been here and choose to call it home. So I think both my career again in mental health and in addictions and in food banks, has really taught me to think about how are these decisions affecting those in the most need, and that's pretty important.
Now let's talk about the perspective you might be bringing to council, and I want to do that by going back to what you had said earlier about the 6-5 votes at council. From some people's perspective, and sort of mine as well, is that 6-5 isn't necessarily a bad way to end a vote, especially on a divisive issue where the community itself is divided on something. So what's the problem with these 6-5s, and what's the way that you would go about solving it?
I think the frustration I've had with it, and I'm hearing this at the doors as I'm knocking at the doors, is that it appears to always be the same 6 and the same 5, right? So I don't know then how much genuine dialogue is happening. And so the theme of my campaign, and I talked about this on my campaign launch, and people can visit my website and see that launch announcement and speech. I talked about the value of actually listening. And so my theme of my campaign is listen, then lead. And listening isn't just waiting your turn to speak. Listening is really, it's a leaning in, it's a give me more, it's I want to understand your point. Do I got your point first before I disagree with it, as opposed to waiting to let you know my disagreement. So I don't know how much authentic engagement there's been around council. I think people have been set on issues. We'll probably get to this. I think of the Parkway. So the Parkway is a pretty entrenched, hard issue. And there's the yes side and there's the no side, but nowhere have we locked anyone up in a room and said, come out with the solution to transportation in this city. They've focused on a single piece of a solution, but not the overall solution. And I wonder what that might beget, were we to say to people, come up with a solution around the problem and not just the single answer of the Parkway. And just to continue on that vein, it was a provocative idea 50 years ago. Is it still provocative? And that's why I'm pretty excited, and I'm going off on a tangent here, but it's why I'm pretty excited about our reset around our official plan. I think that's a critical thing to be happening in the community right now. My hope is that there's deep public engagement around that, and that once we land on the new reset of an official plan, that we tether ourselves to it, and that it's completely understood that this is the direction we're taking as a city for the next 20 to 50 years. So I do think, back to your 6-5 thing though, that I think grinding to consensus is important, because I think it also demonstrates that there's been some listening actually gone on, and some, oh, I get your point. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'm willing to think about it, and that's a group win and not my team wins and your team loses kind of mentality. So I guess that's what I want to see more of, I think.
This kind of feeds into a question. I've asked a couple of candidates this question, which is, if you were presented with something like a divisive issue like the Parkway or PDI, and we'll dive into those issues separately in a few minutes, and you're provided the information that says option A is the right option. It's the most cost effective, it'll make the most money, it moves people around the city the best, and you have people in your ward who are saying, we're afraid that it's going to do this to the city, that it's going to ruin green space, that it's going to ruin our backyards, that it's going to, in the long run, be a more costly deal to taxpayers. And you have to weigh those balances. What do you end up doing if you have people in a council meeting or people in a public meeting who say one thing and your city staff and the information that you have says another?
I think it has to do with the lens that you bring to the decision. I think the last question that should be asked is, how do we afford it? And I think the problem with many of our decisions is the only question we ask is whether we can afford it or not. I think we have to have deeper discussions on what do we want as a city, what are the things that are important for us in the city, how are we going to develop a city, and that the last conversation is around cost. And I think the fact that there's been a tyranny of finance that's gone on. And I'm not being naive. We got to pay for stuff. We got to figure out how to pay for stuff. But if every time an issue comes up, you bring up a good idea, and instead of talking about the idea, I'm beating you about how do we afford it? How do we afford it? How do we afford it? Hang on, how do we afford it? That's going to cause a lot of debt. That doesn't get us to our aspirations. That doesn't get us to being able to dream and think outside the box and create together with citizens, not just the council, not just the 10 people around council. What is it that we want for a city? How do we afford it and how much we should cost? I would argue needs to be one of the last questions. What is it that we desire as a community? What is it we want for our city? And is it green space? Or is it parkways? And how do we engage people around that discussion? One of the things that I really want to push for and advocate for is much more creation of neighborhood associations and resident associations that really inform councillors. I think the real question you're asking, though, is, a typical career politician always only votes with the majority of their ward. And I don't know that that's always the right thing to do. I think by and large you need to be listening to your constituents, representing your ward and their interests. But I do think there are times, and there are some issues, where you've got to, as a councillor, think of the city as a whole and not your ward as a whole. And I'll give you a really good example, and I have no preference on this matter. But you look at the double rake that just got built or is going to get built. And there was a lot of debate about where that was going to be and where it should be, and I bet there was a lot of vying for certain wards for it to be. Did it land in the best place for the city? I think that as a ward representative, as a ward councillor, I think you have to be courageous enough and show some leadership that says there are times when I'm going to choose to act in the interest of the city overall, and that's risky. And for me, getting back to how I would deal with that, I think part of it is, you need to communicate pretty clearly with your ward on an ongoing basis, not just around election time. I heard very little from my councillors in my ward the last 4 years, very little. And I think we need to find better ways of communicating on an ongoing basis decisions that are coming forward to council, and the thinking of a councillor coming and vetting and thinking about issues that are ahead. I think that you have to feel free to act in the interest of the city when it seems right, and completely advocate for the ward when that seems right as well. And you can't care about whether you get elected again. And I think too many politicians are thinking 4 years down the road, what do I need to say and do so that I make sure that I get elected again? If I get elected, I don't care if I get elected 4 years from now. I care about being a strong voice for the city and for the ward, and for, frankly, my values, and I hope that those values are shared with many of the voters out there. I don't care if I get reelected. I care about being authentic and genuine and curious.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get the picture of the type of dialogue that you'd like to engage in while in City Hall. But we're going to take a short break. and we're going to come right back. And I think we're going to dive more into some of these issues that we've been touching on, and I think it's going to be great.
Beautiful. Thanks, Tom.
All right, perfect. So we're back here on the Peter Podcast, and we're going to be talking about a few issues that people care about. And a few of these we've already touched on, but let's go ahead and dive into them anyway, because there's always more to discuss when it comes to the Parkway. The debate never ends. And hopefully it will end some point in the next 70-year range.
You know, from your lips to God's ears, Taylor, that debate ends. I suppose your question is, what's my position on it?
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
You know, my position is I want to spend 4 more years arguing about it.
Do you want to spend 70 more years?
I don't. I certainly don't want to spend. I certainly don't want to spend 7 more years. I think what's exciting right now that's going on in Peterborough. So I mean, just not to be so glib about it. I want to see other options. I think we haven't been able through 50 years of city councils to be able to complete that or do it or convince the public that it's the right thing to do. 50 years. So that says something to me in terms of, and is it still the right idea? It was the right idea 50 years ago. I completely appreciate that. It was built into our official plan. I completely appreciate it.
And it's never been taken out.
And it's never been taken out. And I think what's really critical in the next 6 months to a year, and indeed the council's committed to it, is what's our new official plan going to look like? And I think part of that conversation needs to be, what's an overall transportation plan? Not just one route north and south that's represented by the Parkway, but what's an overall transportation plan that respects people also walk, that respects people also take bikes, that respects people also driving cars? How are we going to calm traffic? And what might it look like if we were to think outside the box and, for example, double our investment in public transportation? Would we incent people to get out of cars and take more public transportation if it was rationalized, if it wasn't hub and spoke, if it really kind of met people's needs? I can walk quicker to a hospital now than I can take a bus to the hospital. So I mean, I want to see a rationalized transportation plan and a plan for growth. And if the goal is, in keeping with the Places to Grow document, Provincial Places to Grow, to intensify the central core more, how much, again, do we still need the idea of a parkway? So I'm against it right now as it stands. I want to see broader conversations on overall transportation plan. And in the meantime, let's fix what's broke. I can't get over the number of streets that don't have sidewalks, for example.
Now, here's one of the issues in regards to not doing the parkway, is that the parkway is written into the official plan. There's an assumption in the official plan that eventually the parkway will get built. And the city has had a couple of opportunities, a couple of outs, if you will, to be able to write out the parkway from the official plan and substitute something else. And that has never happened. It's still in there. And with it in there, it's an assumption that that's going to be built and that's going to fulfill a transportation need for the city of Peterborough.
And more importantly, Taylor, it's running the risk of looking like bait and switch, that we're promising people we're going to build it, but then we're not, and people are developing with that in mind. So I think, again, this is the time, once and for all, to, frankly, come up with other solutions, because we haven't been able to land that one. And when people talk about the parkway, I'm not even sure they know what it means anymore. Do they mean the south extension? Do they mean the north extension? Do they mean the bridge? I'm not sure that people are sure. And so I think we need a reset. We need to take a deep breath and talk about a broader transportation plan and see what needs to take priority within the context of that plan.
So is it time then? And there is a cost associated with writing the parkway out of the official plan. But with that said, it maybe now would be the correct time with the official plan review still ongoing. Is it, if you were elected, would it be finally time to, propose a vote and vote whether or not to remove the parkway from the official plan? It wouldn't be the first time that vote has been held, but do you think that there would be enough support on council to make it happen?
Well, I know that you're trying to corner me on the one issue, yes or no on the parkway, and I'm not obfuscating. Again, I would pivot back to, I would hope that kind of vote wouldn't come forward to council, the in or the out, the one-off, yes or no. I would hope that comes forward to council is a well-vetted plan that we're going to tether ourselves to for the next 20 or 30 years. That's what I would want to vote yes or no on. And within that, if that's part of the official plan, the in or the out, I would want to be voting on the overall official plan. As it stands, as it exists now, I think we can come up with other solutions to move traffic around. And I know that the current council, again, has and I'm not being critical of this decision. I mean, they've charged staff with coming up with 6 different studies, around some of the transportation plans, and I think that needs to dovetail with the redevelopment and the reset of the official plan. And I would certainly be voting yes or no on an official plan, and then I'd want us as a council to commit to some benchmarks of implementation, so that we're not waiting 50 or 70 years on any one piece of it to be implemented. That we really set, with Jeff Humble, at the city, we set some benchmarks against which we can be clear that we're on the right track. I mean, I think, yeah, it sat there for 50 years. Does it need to sit there for another 50 years? I think we need to reset, and we need to focus, and we need deeper engagement around public and expertise around, what is it that people want, and how do we balance green space and moving people around and intensification of the central core, which I think adds value to the city. And these are tough decisions, and I don't want it parsed. And I think that's the politics of this now, that if you're the Parkway, you all of a sudden represent one point of view, right? I'd rather be voting as a councillor on an overall plan that includes, other places of development, as well as transportation, and voting yes or no on that. And hopefully it's aspirational, and it's looking at 20 and 30 and 50 years into the future.
Okay. Now, normally what I do is I do Parkway, PDI, and then housing. I'm going to flip that around a little bit this week, just because the PDI issue is kind of starting to fall into the background. I will still ask you about it. And also, I kind of want your expertise on housing, especially because right now we're in a bit of a housing crunch. As I've said a couple times on the podcast, we're at a low vacancy rate with rental units. Housing prices are up. Peterborough is becoming unaffordable to certain types of people, particularly those with low income. And I kind of want to know where your expertise and your opinion comes in resolving the situation, because right now we're not really getting any help.
Well, I mean, I think housing is a really good example of the growing gap between rich and poor, not just in our community but in our country. I think we have to put unbelievable pressure on the federal government to implement their housing strategy. So they've come out with a strategy. It's not clear that they've added new dollars to that strategy. It looks like they've just moved some dollars around. And it relates specifically to the issue in Peterborough of low vacancy rates, one of the pillars of that housing strategy is a portable housing credit, and I think in the vicinity of $200 or $300 a month, and that people could take that, low income people could take that to whatever community they're in and use that then to offset some of the expensive rent. So I think that's a good idea. I think there's only so much that municipalities can do, and that's not me obfuscating or passing the buck. But the truth is, this is a tri-level issue. So I think the first point is the federal government has to accelerate its implementation of its housing strategy, first and foremost. I think it's tougher to build bricks and mortar housing, and so I think, to its credit, I thought it was really good that the council loosened its view on people setting up basement apartments in Peterborough. I think that was a good decision. I think the market, in that sense, may open up then for folks that are lower income. I think, though, at the end of the day, it's still about basic dollars and how much money people have in their hands, and people that are poor are making choices between paying the rent and going to food banks. I mean, that's just a hard reality. And I think we look at, and I was disappointed in this decision, we look at the provincial government's decision to cancel the basic income study that was going on. Your paper just covered it this morning, or the Examiner covered it this morning. And I think, we didn't know the impact that might have had. So why would we cancel that until we knew the impact that we have? We know anecdotally that it was making a difference in people's lives in terms of being able to think about going to school, in terms of having some stable housing, in terms of having a basic income that allowed them to be thinking more about the future than being embedded in the crisis of being poor and scrambling for your next meal or your next place to live. So I think there's issues of basic income that have to be looked at, and I think we missed an opportunity as a provincial government to understand the power and the impact that might have. So it's a complicated issue, and then you roll into that issues of mental health and addictions. I mean, people are really, really struggling with mental health and addictions, and those sectors, those social service sectors, are under siege in terms of their ability to provide support and wraparound service. And so, we know from the most recent study that the United Way did in partnership with the city, our point in time count, it was an enumeration, and the number two reason people are homeless is just unsafe housing conditions. And so I think, and one of the things I would rail against, quite frankly, if I was on council, is absentee landlords. I think it's important that people that are renting and owning properties and renting to people are held accountable, and that we enforce bylaws around the quality of housing for people. So it's a complex issue that ties into income, that requires all three levels of government to be responsible for, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
So helping people to afford the housing that's there is one part of the strategy. The secondary suite bylaw that got passed, that's another part of the strategy. There's a ton of different parts to this. This isn't you pass one law and the situation gets solved in a year. Mm-hmm. This is something that's going to take years, and it's going to take a lot of different things to deal with. One of the things I hear from people is, and this is especially going to be impactful for your ward that you're running for, town ward, because there's a fear that in town ward you have people who are going in, you have redevelopment going on, which is turning unused space into useful new housing, new commercial space, which is great. But there's also the accompanying fear from some people that redevelopment is going to make something more expensive, that you're taking stuff that, it's not necessarily the nicest right now, but it's low income, it's low rent, and you're gentrifying it is the buzzword, I suppose. Yep. And turning it into something that's, middle income or high income, and you're pushing those people out from areas like the downtown. Is that a fear that you have? Is that something that needs to be dealt with or addressed? Or
Sure. I mean, first of all, I don't think we should disdain middle income people. Middle income people are working class people.
Middle income people are still struggling.
Yeah, are still struggling for sure. And so but I do think and I've met with 3 or 4 developers now, and nobody's being incented to build affordable housing. I mean, we're just, but there is an opportunity, again, with a focus on intensifying our central core. And there's something, and I'm learning about this as well. I mean, you may know more about this than I do, Taylor, but I'm learning about Schedule J, for example. And so that has to do with lands within the central core that have different kinds of requirements, more lax requirements for developers if they're to develop them. And I think if we can kind of work to insist that if you're going to develop, that there's mixed use space, that there's either rent geared to income units, a proportion of them, as well as market rent units, whether they're high end or middle income, as you pointed out. I think we have to advocate for that, because we don't want to ghettoize people, right? We don't want to ghettoize people. Mm-hmm. It's not good for the community. It's not good for our sense of inclusion. It's not good, and frankly, for us in terms of understanding the other. And so I would want to be advocating for that kind of stuff, that we really insist as a council and as a city that if you're coming here, part of our values is that we find a place for everyone, and part of our demonstration of that, part of the leadership around that would be both enticing and ensuring that there's mixed use when developers decide to develop the central core. And I think progressive developers will see the value in that. Because at the end of the day, it's good for the city as well. So that would be my hope, and that certainly would be my intention, and that would be what I would advocate for.
Okay, we're just about to run out of time, so let's go ahead and tackle the PEI debate. Well, we still have a couple minutes left because I want to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I think it's done and dusted. What's there to debate? I mean, sorry to be that glib.
No,
I mean, you're flogging a dead horse. It's done and dusted, and I don't, and what's there to debate? What's going to come forward to the council table? If you're asking me my values, I think water and electricity should stay in public hands. I'm adamant about that. Mm-hmm. But what debate? What debate? And I mean, it's a done deal. You know, I understand that there's a councillor, if not more, tried to get a petition signed, but I don't know that that's gotten any traction to reopen it. I haven't seen any traction on that.
Yeah, and there's also the question of if you do have the support on council to vote to end the deal, which would probably take a 2/3 of council in order to do. The legal implications of that, of backing out of a deal with Hydro One, because they might be able to sue the city over that. So it's less of a question of right now, do you support the deal or not? Because the deal is pretty much done.
Yeah.
Unless the Ontario Energy Board comes back and says we don't support the deal. I guess one of the follow-up questions of the deal, the fallout of it, is what do we do with the money? I know there were some planned hydro projects that have since been canceled by the provincial government. So now there's a little bit of a question as to what's going to happen with that plan.
So the 50 or 54 million that we think is coming into the city's coffers from the deal once
Exactly.
it closes. Yeah. I look, I'd like to see it spent on infrastructure. I'd like it to be spent on what's broken in the city, you know. We're already spending 50 million, you know, of the 100 million to fix what's broken, you know, in terms of the hydro, you know, the stuff in hydro that's broken. I think let's earmark some of that money for things, since it's found money, quote unquote. And again, you know, I wouldn't have supported the sale, but since it's found money, I think let's look at it outside of the budget requirements right now and think a bit creatively about it. Is there a portion of that we could earmark for an acceleration of arts and culture funding? You know, I would love to see, being from downtown Ward, much more street animation, much more art on the street. I mean, is there money we could earmark for that? You know, is there money from that 54 million that we could add to some of the rent supplements that the city pays out, getting back to some of the issues we just talked about? So I would hope that we would not just pay off debt with that money, but that we would look to invest it in things that make the city better. And tracking back to our earlier conversation, Taylor, how does it track to our new revised reset official plan? You know, and what could we begin to accelerate with early dollars in from that 54 million? You know, let's not hoard it. Let's invest it and see what that might help to stimulate.
Okay. Jim, is there anything else that you wanted to add? Any messages that you wanted to send out?
I have to say, Taylor, I said to you off camera and off microphone, I really appreciate that you're doing this for all the candidates. I love the long form. I think if people take time to kind of listen to how people think, they'll get a vibe. And then, of course, I would really ask that your viewers and your listeners, if they only listen and they don't want to look at you or me, consider voting for me in Town Ward in the upcoming election. I will add this piece, because what I'm hearing at the doors, and I think it's really important for people to realize, you get two votes at the door. So you get to vote for two people, not just one person. I think that's important to remind people that that's what we do in our election here. Otherwise, I'm really grateful for the time and the opportunity to share some of my thinking.
Awesome, Jim. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
And you too. Thanks very much.
All right, awesome. And to everybody else, we will see you again soon.